So we're taking a little detour today from our regular Ask an Actuary series that we've been doing to sit down with Liz Farmer today to talk about the municipal bond market and the potential threats facing tax exemptions with the expiration or renewal of some of Trump's tax cuts. For those of you who haven't heard of Liz before, she is a fiscal policy expert and journalist. You may have come across her articles in Forbes or Route 50. She's also a co-host of the Public Money podcast, which, in full disclosure, Odyssey is a sponsor of. And we've also had Liz on a webinar in the past and featured some of her stuff on our site as well. Thanks for taking the time to join me today, Liz.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
Liz, can you tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got into writing about fiscal issues?
Oh, sure. It was almost entirely by accident that I wound up writing about public finance. As you mentioned, I'm a journalist by training, and so I covered for various newspapers, state government, local government in Maryland and DC area. And when two openings came up at Governing Magazine back in 2012, and I applied for the one that said staff writer, not the one that said public finance writer. But after the interview, I was asked by the editor if I wanted to be considered for the other job as well. And of course, two is better than one. So I said yes. And that's how I wound up that's how I got my start writing about public finance. And it was a great place to learn. And I quickly fell in love with writing about state and local fiscal policy because it touches just about everything we do.
And you also have your own Substack newsletter called Long Story Short, where you regularly report on the wonderful world of government, finance, and management. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was, when I became a full-time freelancer, I really missed the regular connection I had with readers. At Governing, I started a newsletter called The Week in Public Finance, and it came out every Friday. And when the magazine shuttered, I got a lot of emails about how people had looked forward to that. And so I started looking into how to keep doing that in a way that would be easy. And I started a Substack newsletter, just kind of in that spirit of being able to keep in touch with people regularly. And it's definitely grown since then. And I'm getting a lot of people reaching out in very much the same way that they used to when I was a full-time writer.
And just so as a disclaimer, you do have a free version of the newsletter, which I think is like an abbreviated version of it. And then you also have a paid version as well, which you can get the full in-depth
articles. Yes.
So now let's jump into what everyone is just dying to know. Can you explain how the tax treatment of municipal bonds differs from other bonds?
Sure. So with municipal bonds, the income earned on the tax-exempt municipal bonds anyway, and these are generally like general obligation bonds. A few other bonds fall into this category, but the government is able to generally to get a lower interest rate on these bonds than they would normally, because the investor who buys these bonds doesn't have to declare the income earned on that. So they're getting a break tax-wise, which means they're typically willing to have a slightly lower interest rate on those bond earnings. And so the municipal market started about 110-ish years ago. It came about basically with the income tax. And so this has been the engine driving infrastructure in the United States for the last century.
And does this apply to all municipal issued debt, or are there different rules for sports stadiums, pension foundation bonds, or other specialty debt?
Yeah, we could go down the many rabbit holes into all the different kinds of municipal bonds. I don't even know all of them, I'm quite sure. But no, there are definitely other kinds of bonds. There are taxable municipal bonds. And there's an interesting story about how the federal government helped subsidize those during and after the Great Recession. And they were called Build America bonds. They were taxable bonds. And so taxable bonds, obviously, you're not getting that tax exempt feature on the investor side. So then the interest rate's going to be a little higher. The federal government then helped subsidize that. So made the cost a bit lower. And what it did is open up the municipal market to foreign investors and other people who aren't eligible for the tax exemption anyway. And so that was largely successful until the sequestration kicked in and the federal subsidy went away. But there are lots of other different kinds of bonds. You mentioned public activity bonds. That's conduit issuer bonds, where the government issues them on behalf of a developer or somebody else who's doing something in the public interest. So theoretically, the developer is the one paying back the debt, but the municipal government is always kind of the backstop for that stuff.
So how much does the tax exemption cost the IRS, and how does that compare to other tax exemptions?
Oh gosh. So it costs about, and I don't have the figure off the top of my head anymore, somewhere in the like 30 billion a year range, which to you and me, of course, is a lot of money. To governments, that's a lot of money, but to the federal government, that's like a rounding error. There are other exemptions, like the home mortgage exemption or the mortgage interest exemption, the exemption on, I think that I'm forgetting the name of it, but there's other exemptions that are much more costly for the federal government than this particular one. But because this is my opinion, but I think because the municipal market is rather obscure, there's like a handful of people who know about it, and most of them are not in Congress. It's an easy target for folks in Congress and for other people to point to and say, I don't really see what that's doing. It looks like a tax break for the rich because the benefits to government isn't immediately clear. And so it tends to be a target very often for Congress to want to kind of claw some money back.
And given the $10,000 cap on state and local tax, also known as SALT, deductions and that cap are also expiring as well, do you think that the two could impact each other? Or in other words, maybe they would fully eliminate SALT but keep muni bond exemptions?
I am not sure. I think with the SALT, it is more, that is an easier one for all of us to understand. I live in Maryland. It's not a particularly high tax state, but we're still impacted by that. My federal taxes have gone up because, or my taxable income went up because of that. And so I think that's something that more directly affects taxpayers than the sort of ethereal concept as a municipal bond tax exemption. So I don't necessarily see them being connected up front. But and honestly, the SALT thing, the SALT exemption is much more kind of a political hot button than I think the municipal bond tax exemption is. That is something that is tends to be talked about more behind the scenes. You're not going to get a lot of people writing about it and explaining it unless it's going to be about like stadium bonds or something else that's easy to target. So I don't necessarily see them being used in the same negotiating space, but they definitely are going to be talked about.
And if the exemption is eliminated, we'd expect borrowing costs to go up for municipalities. If so, wouldn't that increase pressure for more state and local aid and therefore reduce the actual savings?
So I'll take that one at a time. If the exemption is eliminated, yes, borrowing costs would go up. I don't necessarily think the federal government would then increase state or local aid, because the whole point of taking away the exemption is to save money. And it's a lot easier to not spend money on stuff than to say you're going to get more revenue back by eliminating an exemption. And so if the exemption is eliminated, and truthfully, I don't think it will be. I think there are enough people in Congress who get it. But I do think it tends to be trotted out every year or every time this sort of thing comes up as something that is under threat. And so it is a bargaining chip for sure. But I do think that probably most people in Congress kind of understand the concept that the municipal market that is the financing mechanism that funds the vast majority of infrastructure in the United States. And that without that easy, low cost financing, our infrastructure deficit would explode, honestly. And so not to be too dramatic about it, but so I think all of that is pretty clear, but it is a bargaining chip. It is something that Congress can use as a, well, what about this? And then to get whatever else it is. So ultimately, I think this is about lowering the federal deficit, but it's also a lot about politics.
And we know that predictions are a little difficult, but what's your best guess on this, or even odds? Is it 50-50?
My best guess is that the tax exemption will stay. But things like private activity bonds, that came up last time. And something I suspect, so the private activity bonds, the exemption for that, and the tax exemption for advanced refunding bonds. Those are two types of bonds. I mentioned private activity before. Advanced refunding basically allowed a government to refinance sooner than it would have otherwise, and therefore start getting lower interest rates and lower their debt. Back in 2017, those two were trotted out as, we're going to make these not tax exempt anymore. People reacted severely to that, and rightfully so, because private activity bonds typically finance things like hospitals, schools, that sort of thing. Like every once in a while, like the stadiums are the ones that get all the attention because we don't like all that tax breaks going to team owners. And so that got taken away, but the advanced refunding did stay. So that tax exemption was eliminated. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see something similar, a piece of the municipal market under threat. And then perhaps the more controversial one is taken away, but the low-hanging fruit, that one that didn't draw as much controversy, might say. So that would be something I would keep an eye out for. But in case of overall tax exemption, I do think that's going to stay.
And Congress is likely to take their time and do things around the end of 2025. What would you recommend for our governmental partners, clients, that they do as we approach 2025?
I think I'll repeat what the GFOA says a lot, which is just educate, 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 and that's sort of one of my a passion project of mine, is that I mentioned early on that public finance touches everything we do, but it is rather complicated, rather convoluted. The terms in public finance they just sound strange. And so it is like learning a new language, but it should not be, because it is generally easy to understand that the money I give to government comes back to me in forms of schools, roads, parks, all of that stuff that I care about. But the way in which that happens is strange and confusing, and that's where we kind of get hung up on public finance. So the more we can focus on the end result and what matters, rather than how things happen, I think that is the message that politicians and elected officials hear.
Absolutely. Liz, thanks so much for taking your time to share insights with us today. Is there anything we missed or that you want to share as we wrap up today?
No, just another plug for my Substack newsletter, Long Story Short, and also the Public Money Pod. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to chat.
Absolutely. Thanks, Liz. And for our viewers, just a quick reminder that if you're not, again, already a subscriber, definitely check out Liz's newsletter, Long Story Short, on Substack. I'll make sure to include a link to that, as well as the podcast too. If you're interested in municipal issues, which I'd assume that you likely are if you're watching this, it's definitely a great resource to have on hand. And thanks again. We'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, Stephanie.